Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, of course, I thought that I would post my little fight review of the Terence Bud Crawford versus Shawn Porter fight, which I thought was an excellent fight. And at the end of the day, at least in the final part of the fight, the second half of the fight, at least as long as it lasted, it has to be remembered as a great performance by Terence Bud Crawford. Just to talk about the fight before we get into a lot of the other details and where, in my opinion, Terence Crawford now ranks on the pound for pound list, if he moved up at all, or if he's now the number one pound for pound, in my opinion, after a performance like this. And if you've watched my videos consistently, you already know my opinion on that anyway, but just for anyone who may be new here. Anyways, we're going to talk about all that. But just to talk about the fight, I have to give Terence Bud Crawford a hell of a lot of credit here. And in previous videos, I've said this about Terence Crawford, and I released a video, I believe, a few days ago, saying that Terence Bud Crawford, he really has to prove himself here. And of course, the Terence Crawford fanboys and, Terence Crawford fans, they got mad at me and they said, oh, what you mean? Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., they have nearly the same resumes. Not really. That's not me trying to insult Terence Crawford, but before this win that he had over Shawn Porter, the biggest win that he had in his career was either Yuriorkis Gamboa, who, in my opinion, that fight was very similar to the Mikey Garcia versus Errol Spence Jr. fight, except a lesser version of it because Mikey Garcia is on a higher level at the end of the day, in my opinion, than what a Yuriorkis Gamboa ever was. It just is what it is. But when it comes down to it, all in all, and then on top of that, he beat Victor Postal, who is a decent fighter, but I would never really consider him, A plus or anything like that. But Shawn Porter, and it is understandable that Shawn Porter does have a few losses in his career. And if I wanted to discredit, Terence Crawford, or if I really hated Terence Crawford and all in all, I was super upset that, he got this victory and I wanted to be someone like a Dante's Boxing Nation or Aki TV or one of these LDBC or new media channels or one of these biased channels when it comes down to it, usually the ones that try to tear down Canelo Alvarez. I could sit here and say, yeah, Terence Crawford, he got to win over Shawn Porter, but let's be real. Shawn already had a few losses. I could come up with some bullshit excuse like that, but let's be real. You can take a look at a certain fighter, even if they have a few losses in their career, and you can tell when a fighter is completely washed up and completely dragged down by wars, and you can tell when a fighter is still at a very decent point in their career. Now, is it possible, that maybe Shawn Porter could have been maybe a teensy tiny bit wore down from some of those other wars that he had been against Danny Garcia or against Keith Thurman, Adrian Broner, and, of course, Errol Spence Jr.? Maybe. But what other fighter besides Terence Bud Crawford can we say would have done this to Shawn Porter? And certain things, all in all, that I noticed in this fight is that Terence Bud Crawford, he he really had Shawn Porter. This is the main thing that I noticed, especially heading into the second half of the fight. Shawn Porter, in my opinion, has never really had an A-grade gas tank because of his style, and he always tries to be a major bull and go balls to the wall when it comes down to it. And Shawn has always kind of been known to tire out, especially within those last two rounds. So, I kind of expected that Crawford more than likely was going to last him in the stamina department. But a big part of the reason why Terence Crawford was able to knock out Shawn Porter was not just because he was able to hit him right. He was really starting to wear down Shawn Porter. He was really starting to exhaust him. And as the fight went along, I started noticing that Shawn Porter kept keeping his hands more down and more down and more down. And I noticed that he looked more tired and more tired and more tired. And like I said, and I'm going to stand by this statement, in my opinion, this is hands down, so far, the toughest fight in Terence Crawford's career. Now, I understand that he ended up getting a 10th round stoppage. But when it comes down to it, you can still get a stoppage in a fight and it still be the biggest test of your career or the toughest fight of your career. Because you could tell within the first 7 rounds of this fight that Terence Crawford was like, God damn, this dude, Shawn Porter, he has Terence Crawford, you can say maybe has been challenged before because he's fought good fighters, but I would never say that he's fought a definitive, at least great fighter. Shawn Porter, yes, he has a few losses, but he's a great fighter. There's certain fighters out there that, yes, they have a few losses on their record, but Shawn Porter is a great fighter. He is going to be a Hall of Famer at the end of the day. There is no debate about that. Shawn Porter is a dude that is extremely talented. He's a very talented athlete. He's decently powerful. When it comes down to it, this is an A-grade win. There's just no way getting around it. So I have to give Terence Crawford a hell of a lot of credit here. And the way that he stopped Shawn Porter, the way that he got past him, and the way that Shawn Porter and his dad looked after that fight, I mean, it was the same look that I seen with certain people all in all when they see someone like a LeBron James in the NBA, or when they see all in all someone like, I don't even know how to compare it. Like, I'm trying to think all in all. Basically, what I'm saying is this: Kenny Porter and Shawn Porter, the way that they looked at Terence Crawford, they basically said, wow, this dude is just on a whole nother level. And this is my opinion. When it comes to the pound for pound ranking after this win, I can't rank Terence Crawford as the number one pound for pound fighter, at least quite as of yet, because, Shawn Porter, even though he is a great fighter, there's no doubt about it. You did beat Shawn Porter when, he was not a champion and he was not probably even ranked within the top 20 pound for pound. But I do give Terence Crawford a hell of a lot of credit because Shawn Porter still is an A grade fighter. There's no doubt about it. Now, if Terence were to get a fight against Errol Spence Jr. next, which I'm hearing through the grapevine, the WBC and the WBO maybe is trying to coerce those two into getting a big fight next, and we'll see what happens. Let me also state this. I've never been a big fan of this narrative of everyone over at the PBC has been ducking Terence Crawford when it comes down. I've never been a big fan of that narrative because, I've never been a big supporter of that narrative because Terence Crawford, at the end of the day, it was his decision to sign with Top Rank, promotion all in all that had none of the other elite welterweights. So it is what it is. But what I will say is this: Errol Spence Jr. apparently showed up to the fight of Terence Bud Crawford, and he certainly did not go into the ring with Terence Bud Crawford. At least I did not see it. If he did, it was when I wasn't there or when I didn't see it. So it is what it is. All I'm going to say is this: I'm not going to necessarily say that Errol Spence is 100% scared of Terence Crawford, but I don't think that he's super duper excited about that Terence Crawford matchup. And once again, I don't think that Errol Spence Jr., I'm not going to say that he's ducking Terence Crawford. I'm not going to go as far to say that, but what I will say is this: you can tell by Errol Spence's talk, you can tell when a fighter, when they talk about certain fighters, you can tell when they know when someone else is special above some of these other fighters. And when Errol Spence Jr. talks about Terence Crawford, once again, I don't think all in all that he's ducking Terence Crawford, but you can tell that Errol Spence Jr., he knows that, wow, this dude Terence Crawford, he's a little bit different. Just the way that he talks about him, he has a completely different energy with Terence Bud Crawford than what he did with any of the other welterweights that he fought. So I'm not saying that Terence Crawford 100% beats Errol Spence Jr., but what I am saying is this: if Errol Spence Jr. is going to beat Terence Crawford, he's going to have to go to hell and back. That's all I'm going to say. Who would I personally favor in that matchup right now between Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence Jr.? I mean, Errol Spence Jr., in my opinion, has to be looked at as the number one welterweight just because of his resume. And, of course, he beat Danny before Terence did, and he beat Porter when he was a champion. And, he also beat Mikey when he was undefeated. And he beat Kilbrook at least when he had the IBF championship. Of course, notably, he ended up getting knocked out by Golovkin, but it is what it is. Bottom line is this, and people can deny it all they want to, but Errol Spence Jr. does have the better welterweight resume especially. But after seeing this fight, do I believe that Errol Spence beats Terence Crawford? No, I personally don't. I think that Terence Crawford, and the thing that separates great fighters like Terence Crawford and Terence Crawford after this fight, I am going to have to see it against Errol Spence Jr., especially because that is the number one guy there. But you can tell when you take a look at Terence Crawford, at least this is what I got. Terence Crawford is probably going to transition into an all-time great fighter, and this was really the first step into that. I mean, of course, he did work at the other weight divisions as well, but like I said, there was no win in his career that was anywhere near to this level. And the fact that he was able to beat Shawn Porter the way that he did, like I said, I have to give him a hell of a lot of credit here, when it comes down to it, because no one has, I'm not saying that Crawford did not have his troubling moments against Porter, but when it comes down to it, like I said, there's a reason why Crawford not only stopped him, but he really had to turn it up. And, Crawford, when it comes down to it, there's certain athletes out there that, they may not be a genius in math, they may not be a genius in, school or anything like that, or, they may not have a super duper IQ in other areas. And that's not me calling Terence Crawford stupid by any means. I have no idea, 100% who he is as a person behind the scenes or what he gets involved in. All I'm saying is this: you may see certain people that you may not even think that they're that sharp, but for whatever they do, their profession, they're a damn genius. They may be the most intelligent person in the world at that one profession. And Terence Crawford, I'm not sure how intelligent he is outside the ring or with other things, but as a boxer, he is truly a genius. And that's what separates himself, I believe, from other fighters, because when I look at Terence Crawford, like I said, he reminds me a little bit of a poor man's Mayweather, and that's still a great fighter. I don't think that he's as defensively responsible as Mayweather was. All in all, I don't think that he's as great as Mayweather was, but Terence Crawford, his adaptability, and all in all, when it comes down to it, his ability to just, really turn it up whenever he needs to. And Terence realized, let me give him a lot of credit for this. Terence realized when he needed to tune it up and turn it up in this fight because he knew all in all that it was a very rough competitive fight. And about round 4, round 5, round 6, somewhere around there, Terence really started to throw against Shawn Porter, started to throw balls to the wall, and he said, you know what? I'm going to have to risk it against this guy. In order to possibly beat Shawn Porter, I can't back up the whole entire time. I'm going to have to exchange with this guy, and let me give Terence credit for this as well. He has a little bit of a better chin than what I thought. All right, because I've seen Terence Crawford hurt a few times in the past. I've seen him hurt against Aegis Kavalauskas. I've seen him hurt overall against Gamboa. I've seen him hurt in a couple of other fights. But he was able to take, and Shawn, he's no slouch. This dude can punch. He was able to take most of Shawn's punches. He was able, maybe a little bit wobbly here and there, but nothing all in all where I saw where I was like, wow, I think he's about to get knocked down. So it's not like Crawford can't get hurt, but do I think all in all that, do I think that Errol Spence is going to be able to outbox Terence Crawford? I doubt it. I don't see it. In my opinion, that is kind of like the smaller version of Sugar Ray Leonard versus Marvin Hagler. That's like if Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Leonard fought each other if they were a similar size. Because Errol Spence Jr., he kind of reminds me of a Marvin Hagler. He's a person that, he can fight in a multitude of ways when it comes down to it, but he's mainly a pressure fighter. I don't see how you're going to be able to box backwards against Crawford. You have to go forwards on him. I mean, he has a 74-inch reach when it comes down to it. He has very quick feet, extremely quick feet. He has excellent hand speed. When we just talk about almost all the categories between Crawford and Errol Spence, I just don't know a lot of categories, just at least in terms of skills and athleticism. I'm not sure if there's, besides maybe raw natural power, and maybe even there, who knows? Terence Crawford may even have the advantage over him there. Who knows? But when it comes down to it, Terence Crawford, man, I just see when it comes to the skills and, to pay the bills and a certain amount of other things, I think that Terence, that most of the check boxes, I think he has most of the checks over Errol Spence Jr. But it is what it is. Anyways, it'll be very, very interesting to see what happens. It'll be very, very interesting. I'm very excited. I'm hoping that fight happens next. I do have my doubts, but we'll see all and know what happens. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.